Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Howling Coyote podcast. And I'm really honored tonight to have Carl Mika from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. And I came across Carl through searching on Indigenous philosophy. And I downloaded some of his papers and was really inspired by his writing and reached out to him, and he so kindly agreed to be on the podcast. And so I'm thrilled to have you, Carl. And if you would be so kind as to introduce yourself. But first, I should mention that I speak from the unceded territory of the Penobscot Nation of the Wabanaki Confederacy, and I wish to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and future. And now, Carl, if you could introduce yourself and we'll get underway.
Cool. Kia ora tātou I runga anō I te āhuatanga o te wā. Thank you very much, Lewis, for inviting me to talk to you all today. I'm Maori of the Tūhourangi and Ngāti Whanaunga iwi, or tribes, and it's great to be here to be able to talk to you, and greetings to you all. So this is a kind of, I'm talking today about the interconnection of things in an era of colonisation. When I first did this PowerPoint, I was going to talk about education, but I'm not going to actually focus on education. I'm wanting more to talk about it more generally. And I've been interested in this for a long time, where things in the world are interconnected, and what the nature of that interconnection is, and how the human self relates to that interconnection. And it seems to me that most Indigenous peoples have a firm philosophy underpinned by the thinking that everything in the world is interconnected. I don't think that that's anything new. And if I was to just stop there, then it would be kind of like, well, nothing new is being said here. But I think it has massive repercussions for everything, how we view the world, how we heal, perhaps, how we view well-being, how we view systems such as law, how we educate, how we articulate ourselves, or our thinking. I think if I just want to talk about what's piqued my interest in this area. If I think back to some discussions with elders, especially, I was always aware that there was an assumption, an unsaid assumption. Sometimes it was articulated, sometimes it was spelled out, that things in the world were your relations, that things in the world were interconnected, and that you were a very small part of that interconnection. And it could be something as everyday as just a discussion or asking a question of an elder and the nature of a response. So what comes to mind for me is one of my elders I spent a lot of time with, and we would talk about genealogy and things like that. And if I asked a question, she wouldn't necessarily answer. And later on, there might be a kind of answer that was forthcoming, but it was an answer that was not directly related or didn't appear to be directly related to what I asked. And at that young age, I kind of thought to myself, well, I don't understand what's being got at here, But it would be some months or years even down the line that I would discover that what she had said made perfect sense in relation to the question somehow. But to me, what sat behind that was a view of language almost, and the sacredness of language, and the relationship of language to the rest of the world, so that when you asked a question, it had a material effect on the world. It wasn't just a connection of logic or an expression of something, an intellect that was going on. There was something much bigger at play. And that's why sometimes when you asked a question, you didn't go and respond directly, because you allowed the fullness of the entity or the materiality of the question, the language inherent to the question, and the world it connected with to manifest. And to answer directly would be to kind of cut across that. And sometimes even, I think, and one of my friends, Cheryl Smith, has talked about this, Maori colleague as well, that there's a tendency for people to think that they can collect knowledge through questioning. And this is not necessarily a thing which reflects the interconnection of our relations. So that was one aspect of it. And then later on, after I'd qualified in law and practiced for a while, I noticed that something was happening in what we call the Waitangi Tribunal when I was working and representing Māori clients there. Now, the Waitangi Tribunal is a tribunal that's set up to hear Māori grievances. What it does is so anything to do with like land, even knowledge, language that's been adversely affected by Crown policy or by law becomes an issue and can be looked at by the Waitangi Tribunal. But what I noticed at the Waitangi Tribunal was, even though sometimes the hearings would be conducted, so it's a quasi-judicial forum, even though the hearings would be sometimes conducted in Māori, there was an assumption about how the world was arranged in the language or in the hearings, which didn't reflect the holistic nature of our language. So what appeared to me to be happening was that we were using our language to reflect a fragmented view of the world instead of an interconnected one. And this became interesting for me because it was almost like, in this instance, the law, by its very nature, by its assumption, by its philosophical assumption, divorced the human self from the non-human world because of its ordering of things in the world and the placing of the self in relation to those things. That became very interesting for me. And then when I started to get into this, I suddenly became aware that there were ideas out there. And so I became interested in the construct of idea itself from a Maori perspective. And that I still haven't got into, that does my head in a way. I find it quite hard to get my head around that, but I've gone there in some ways. And I've come to a tentative conclusion that what we view as an idea, because of the language used, doesn't exist with Māori. We have a different terminology, and that terminology relates us to the world through our perception in a completely different way to what the idea does. And then I've also, when I say subsequent observations about students, I don't sit there observing them. It's sort of, it's kind of a bit surveillant and creepy. I just happen to have noticed that when I've taught on the sort of thing we're talking about today, even to just first year students, and this is I'm not saying that there's something inherently different or innately different between Māori and Pākehā or European students, but it seemed to me that Māori students understand the paradox of existence that I was talking about, and Pākehā students found it incredibly difficult to understand. And that made me think, in an education system, because I have come from the Faculty of Education, that our Māori students have to deal with a different worldview every day. I mean, of course, that makes sense, but the nature of that worldview is such that there's a kind of a conformity between meaning, which doesn't exist in a Māori worldview. And so we have to deal with that on an everyday basis. It just made me aware that for once, Pākehā students seem to be grappling with a metaphysics that wasn't of their own. And I found that interesting, whereas Māori students seem to gel with it. Now, there are some themes on interconnection from a Māori perspective that I'd quite like to talk about. Am I going too quickly or anything? Can't hear you, Lewis. Yeah.
No, I'm muted. No, it's fabulous. And would it be fun for you if I chimed in from time to time?
No, please do. Anyone.
Okay, I will. That'll be fun. Yeah, because I was thinking of here among the Lakota, which is my people, it's expected that an elder waits 4 days to give you an answer, or else 4 years, or
Yeah.
else never.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. And I thought that is so right on. I mean, it's amazing the similarities between, North America and New Zealand among Indigenous elders.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suspected that was true for where you're from as well, from over there. And it's, to me, there's a deeper implication with it. It's how you treat the non-human world through language.
Yeah. And the question is more important than the answer, is what I learned. Like having a good question is better than having an answer.
Yeah. Yeah, and it might not be an answer you like if you do get one.
Right. That's so true.
Yeah. In relation to interconnection from a Māori perspective, Te Ahu Karamu Royal notes that the land and the person become one, and I'll just move the screen a bit, as in the well-known term tangata whenua, which means the person is the earth is the person. Māori are known in New Zealand as tangata whenua, which means indigenous, but it means people of the earth. And that's what he's talking about there. But he's making an observation there about, he's separating person and earth out, but at the same time he's making a concerted effort to show that they are one. And this is an interesting thing about interconnection, I think, because if I read the literature, there seems to be two schools of thought. One is that interconnection takes place with sort of entities that are connected through a life force. And I'm not sure if these are entirely separate, and then the other one is that in fact everything is one. And that's the one that I tend to have delved into more, because I find that more challenging. The idea that things occupy their own space but are interconnected by a life force, I think is an interesting one, and that seems to be where most people fall, I think. But the idea that everything is one is probably the more challenging to a dominant Western worldview. And I might come back to that. But in all cases, in both cases, I think we can see that humanity's status as interconnected with this, is one where one is not superior to other things in the world. That seems to be something that comes through in people's writing, but also in the teaching of our elders. And importantly, all things does not just include tangible objects. It can be ancestors and so on. And ancestors, and I think there's a tendency to view ancestors as solely human, or there's a growing tendency to do that, certainly for Māori. And my thinking is that actually a rock can be an ancestor, a mountain can be an ancestor. And when, I say that there seems to be this tendency to move towards humanistic view of it, but actually when we do talk about these things, we do say, oh yes, no, the mountain is our ancestor. And your ancestor is not necessarily past as well. I tend to think that actually an ancestor although it doesn't fit with the English, the obligations of the English language, an ancestor can be something that is the so-called future. So I don't know, these are just some of my speculations here, but I do know that all things does not just include tangible objects. Interestingly, there was in the 80s, in the 1980s, there was a Waitangi tribunal hearing about the language, because the language was in a really bad state, the Maori language. And so a group of Maori speakers, mainly, I think, took a claim to the Waitangi tribunal and said, the Crown's really done bad things to the language, it's on its way out. And the Crown tried to argue, as in the government tried to argue, that the language is not a tangible object, so it doesn't require protection, more or less. And the strong argument from Māori is that intangible things are just as valuable, just as precious as those things which cannot be seen and kind of cannot be touched. My final point in this particular slide is that we talk about interconnection, and we talk about it in a theoretical way, and I think that's because of colonisation now. But in the past, it would have been something that was just simply understood. I don't know. It may well have been discussed, but I think we are discussing it because something else has been introduced, which is antithetic to interconnection. I once had someone from Germany say to me that if you didn't have a verb to be in Māori, then you had no notion of being, which I took exception to, but I kind of am slightly amused by. And what it suggests is that, you need the language there in order to be able to, everything is within language. But I think there was an assumption of being, whatever that is, within everything that took place. And it's probably the same with interconnection. In fact, you could probably replace the term interconnection with being, certainly through a Māori lens. But return again to Te Ahu Karamu Royal's work. He is actually one of the main original writers on Māori philosophy in terms of the self's relationship with the rest of the world. And I've done a bit of a translation there, and that is, the forms of the world are amazing. The movement of the sun, the lapping of the tide, the darkness and the light, these manifestations of the world are amazing to see.
I would love to hear you say it in Maori.
Oh, Māori, okay.
Yes.
He whakamiharo ngā āhuatanga o te ao ara, te whitinga o tamanui te rā, te ngungurutanga o te tai, te pauritanga me te awatea, e nei tū āhuatanga o te ao he whakamiharo ki te titiro atu. The interesting thing about the Māori language is that it's quite a sort of a dynamic thing. So even if if it doesn't appear to be a verb, there's a sense of energy or some sort of galvanic motion underneath the term. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but it's like the words themselves are alive.
It does, because in North America, 80% of the words are verbs. So in Lakota, so to be black is a verb. It's not an adjective. Or to be white is a verb. And, the same thing is true here where I live, which is Wabanaki territory, that it's all about verbs and not about nouns. So there's that also incredible similarity.
Yeah, I think, those linguistic categories are false ones for us. They just don't, you can break it down that way if you like and teach the language that way, but really every noun, every so-called noun has a resonance. So it becomes active,
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it, actually, because it's probably colonized to think about nouns and verbs.
I tend to think it is. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's all in motion. It's all in movement.
Mm.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I have quite a thing about language, so I've become, I became aware of that the implausibility of those categories for a Maori view of language. Yeah, they do colonize because like every aspect of categorization, really, strict categorization where things aren't allowed to pass backwards and forwards between each other. I think I automatically get a bit suspicious of that. Yeah. If we think about the importance of interconnection from Maori thought, we see discussions about humanity's engagement with the environment. This is becoming more and more important, and there's a really vigorous debate happening in Aotearoa, New Zealand at the moment about this, because mātauranga Māori or Māori knowledge proponents argue that what we have to offer may be a new perspective on how to treat the environment. And that in turn has given way to an argument about whether mātauranga Māori is science. This has become quite a vigorous debate here. My own view, and a lot of my Māori colleagues would disagree with me, it seems, but my own view is that they're not the same. Mātauranga Māori is, they're both sophisticated, but they both work in opposite directions, and they start from different premises. One is one of interconnection, the other one is much more of, there is no relationship between the observer and the thing being observed. Mātauranga Māori would definitely not say that. It would say that there is this massive, this immediate and strong link between what you seem to be observing, but which in fact you are part of. But yeah, that's going to be an interesting debate as it pans out, and it's become quite political. And Indigenous writer Arola notes the intellectual and ethical maxim of the commitment to the belief that all things are related. So that's an ethical stance that we need to be adopting, interconnection or a view of interconnection, and that is perhaps so that the integrity of things in the world can be fully protected, so that we don't go through and basically fragment them up and splice them out for our own enjoyment or for knowledge, as it's often called these days. And so what we have to do is make sure, what I take from Arola is that we have to make sure that everything needs to be able to manifest as on its own and in its own way, and relate to other things in its own way. And the other thing that doesn't really pop up, because philosophy is often thought of as a very abstract pursuit and not really related to anything apart from itself, like it's it kind of sets its own rules, and it's self-sustaining in its own right and independent. But my view is, for us, is that it's key to think of our relationship with the world as a sort of a spiritual or philosophical wellness. I think most Indigenous peoples, from what I understand anyway, certainly Māori, would argue that the way you perceive something relates to how well you are. Like, do you perceive something as being on its own, or do you perceive something as being completely interrelated with the rest of the world, implicated with it? Yeah, I think there's things about that. And it's something I'm really quite interested in, because I think it is something that could be brought into the topic of the immediate topic of wellness. I think Vine Deloria Jr. No, was it? I think it was him who said that there was a sort of a schizophrenia occurring with a kind of metaphysical schizophrenia occurring with students when they were kind of blocked off from their a sort of more authentic way of viewing the world through education. And that for me is like an inroad into that sort of discussion. In New Zealand, we have an esteemed Maori scholar called Mason Jury, and Mason Jury devised what's called the whare tapawha, the house with four walls. It's very well known, and it talks about the four components of Maori health being interconnected as one house. It uses the metaphor of a house. I think if we were to talk about philosophical wellness, it would fit within the spiritual wellness or the mental wellness wall, if you like. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the our ancient entities that confer interconnection. And they also, in a sense, confer unknowability about any particular one thing. That's my view. They don't, so you can have clarity and light and understanding, but immediately you also have like a pullback of that so that you don't know the full nature of what a thing is. And if we start there with the term there, which is kore, which means nothingness. I think often these terms are thought of in terms of cosmology, but they're not thought of in terms of everyday existence. That's one of the problems that we face through colonisation, is that these particular entities are thought of as being separate, you know, transcendent from the rest of the world, a bit like a Christian God in a way. But actually they frame how we do everything at every moment of our lives and how we perceive any other thing as well. So kore means nothingness. Kore, if you have a repetition of a word within one word, it often means the intensification of the original meaning. So nothingness becomes intense nothingness to the point of positivity. And I've started to do some writing on nothingness. I can't really remember much of it off the top of my head. It's that kind of thing. But it's one of the things to say is that it's full. Nothingness is filled with potential. So when we talk about kore or nothingness, we're talking about one of the first stages of the creation of all things. And the world started as a kind of a nothingness, but it was never completely nothing. It was also what was yet to come, what could come still. Uriuri, which is gloom or darkness or sadness. It's interesting that uriuri means both a stage of creation and a state of emotion. Actually, one of our terms, porangi, which is meant to mean crazy or mad, or that's how it's been translated, incorporates both po, which is darkness or nothingness, and rangi, which is light or related to light. So it's like occupying a state of darkness and lightness at the same time. It's like you, and it wasn't necessarily thought of as a bad thing in traditional Māori thought to be what we would today call crazy, I don't think. Like you would be occupying another realm at the same time as occupying this physical one, if we could put it that way. And I think that becomes clear if we look at that term. That's sort of an aside, but what is interesting for me with that particular term is that it does talk about that. It does talk about the human and possibly the non-human state of orientation towards the world at a particular time. And for humans, that would be emotion, probably. Marama means light or understanding. Interesting term because it's often used in policy. and even I think by government, in government literature. And I don't think that that's incidental, because if we talk about the Enlightenment, it's possible that we've been colonized to think of light as being the preferred state, and therefore clarification of an idea or a thing in the world. So, you know, te ao marama is meant to mean the light of the world of light, the world of understanding. We've emerged into this world of light, and a lot of policy documents talk about that. We've left the darkness behind, we've left nothingness behind. We're in this state where we can understand things, we can use reason. As you probably will gather, I do have a problem with that, because it does neglect those earlier stages of creation and those earlier states of being, which, you know, basically constitute us. And the problem with colonization here is that it's made us complete understanders or knowers. Papatuanuku is a really fascinating entity. The Earth Mother. There's a lot that can be said here about that. Papatuanuku is the rock foundation beyond expanse, or the infinite, but she's often referred to as the Earth Mother. And this is where we become confused with language again, because it's not simply Earth that we see outside, but it's actually Earth. I think of Papatuanuku as something which we exist within. It's almost like the all. It's another word for the all, A-double-L. And it's not something we simply walk upon. If you look at the origins of the word, excuse me, episteme, that means to stand upon, which gives you an immediate view of how knowledge is to be obtained. With, excuse me, with Papatuanuku, this is not the case. We are within this particular kind of benefit, this phenomenon, which is we often call our mother. One that is forgotten here is the Sky Father, or Rangi Nui. Rangi can mean, as I was saying, light, or it can mean resonance. And Nui means large or big or grand. And McNeill, I think Rangi Nui is neglected in favour of Papatuanuku, or the Earth Mother. And Rangi enunciates the rhythm and the sense of life force vibrations. And I've speculated that Rangi can be thought of as one way of talking about a primordial language that was meant to be reflected in human speech. What I'm trying to say there is that language is bigger than the human language. Language is something which emanates from somewhere where we can't see. And maybe our language is meant to reflect that primordial, that very first language. So I want to turn here to the opposite of what I've been talking about, but that which holds sway in how we do relate to the world. And that is this kind of pervasive idea that the all doesn't exist, and that things in the world are in fact very separate, have their own characteristics, and occupy their own space. And colonisation, if we look at its history in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we see that colonisation is such that one of its primary drives is to instill this belief that the world is fragmentable, and so it's knowable. And therefore your pursuit should be one, your existential state should be one of the eternal knower. And there's various problems with this, which, you know, you may be aware of. Universities, I've surmised, are particularly prone to this problem, but it starts really from very young. We think about the education system, it starts with teaching someone to be a critical thinker. Now, critical is a loaded term, and I've got no doubt that Indigenous peoples had their own mode of criticality, but it's not necessarily the one that's based on the ancient Greeks. In fact, it won't be. So that's a problem that we have to deal with, that exists within every aspect of our lives. And one of the other things that is directly opposed to Māori thought is that it's the human being who determines the outcome of expression. It's the human being who determines what something will be, even in advance. So colonisation is so thorough that we are taught that we can, even before we see something, we subconsciously know that we'll be able to define what it is, its parameters, its characteristics, its properties, and therefore its lack of connection with other things in the world. Finally, I thought I'd talk about interconnection and research for Māori, particularly for the Māori academic. I've got a quote there from Māori Marsden, and he talks about striving towards excellence, but it's interesting because he says here, and I've bolded this this part of the quote, is that refers not only to humans, the striving for excellence, but to all created things. And so my point is that we need to develop a mode of articulating the world, and this will be a massive challenge for universities to accommodate. We need to develop a mode of articulating the world so that the world's things can be kept together rather than separate. And that starts with the basis of writing, perhaps. Maybe writing is inherently predisposed to making things separate, but I'm not convinced about that. Maybe there are ways around that. And so one of the ways that I've started to do that is to show my uncertainty whilst articulating an argument. As a writer, you're taught to be completely certain about your propositions. And I've found it fascinating to show the, the fallibility in my propositions within the article, for instance, that I'm writing, to go back and show how there's mistakes made in thinking any way that we can think completely logically as Indigenous writers, logic according to the Western rules of fragmentation. So anyway, that concludes my my presentation. Thanks for listening, everyone. And if anyone has any questions, fire away.
Well, I really appreciated your writing, because I think it's really difficult to be Indigenous and academic because of what you say, that one, to acknowledge the invisibles and to acknowledge the spiritual dimension is a kind of academic suicide almost.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. And yet, as Indigenous people, we know that the invisibles matter, that they're very present, they're very connected to us, and that they act in the world. And we have, I think, tremendous uncertainty about what they'll do and what they did, but we feel their presence. And sometimes they reveal themselves in their actions, and sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
But to acknowledge that in an academic setting makes you sound crazy.
Mm.
And it's funny because I've sort of been on the edge of the academy for most of my career. And I reread one of my books recently, and I thought, wow, and you thought that was mainstream? What are you, crazy? Yeah. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, it is. It's hard to do that. Sometimes you can use a Western theorist as a Trojan horse to get that kind of thinking in. But or a well-established Indigenous person to kind of introduce it. It's almost like once you get it in there, it opens a bit of a chink there. Maybe.
maybe.
It depends how outrageous you want to be, you know?
Right, right.
Yeah.
Well, and you know, my field is medicine,
Yeah.
and we're probably the most rational, empirical, positivist bunch of people in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, my interest has been how do people get well? And and what's intrigued me throughout my career has been people that defy the trajectories that conventional medicine sets for them. So an example, we have a friend, Becky from South Dakota, Pine Ridge Reservation, who was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And at the Indian Health Service Hospital, you know, basically they said, go home and die. There's nothing we can do for you. And, um, you know, I was a small part of organizing a traditional response that included intense ceremony, not done by me, but done by some very, well, Vine Deloria would say, powerful people on the reservation. And it's 20 years later, and she's still alive.
Mm-hmm.
And and that's what fascinates me. And it's not a valid topic in the academy.
No.
No, because it invokes, well, I guess, and maybe you could speak to this. There's this notion of things are not true if they can't be replicated, you know, 100 times in a row.
Mm-hmm.
And um, I don't know how many people could go into ceremony and misplace their pancreatic cancer. But it seems to me that one instance is powerful in and of itself, even if it can't be replicated. And can you speak to this demand for replicability in the modernist paradigm? What is that all about?
I haven't actually thought of it in terms of replicability. When you were talking though, it reminded me of being involved with an ethics committee at one stage, and that's all about, you know, really it's all about harm to human beings. And I raised the issue of how can we, you know, what would an ethics look like if it did no harm to anything, and then including non-humans, and then on the heels of that, how could we ever police as an ethics committee a style of writing that didn't fragment things in the world. And that went down like a lead balloon. It's kind of like,
I can
yeah,
imagine.
sort of reminds me a little bit of what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think
Well,
it comes down to evidence, doesn't it? If something can be seen, it therefore exists. But if it can't be seen, if it can't be verified, yeah.
well, and it's interesting because it's, so to speak, in this, am I correct to call it modernist paradigm?
I think so, yeah. I think it
Yeah,
does that.
that my experience, my observations are unimportant.
Mm.
It's statistics that matter.
Yeah.
And and um, so once upon a time I went about collecting stories of people who had, I humorously I said, beat the reaper. People who had experienced these outcomes that medicine said were not possible. But of course, people on the reservation accepted as completely plausible and possible. And I thought naively that a large case series would hold some sway. It didn't. So, but it, but so so maybe there's that. I guess there's that whole question of of epistemology
Mm.
and what qualifies as knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in indigenous country, careful observation qualifies as knowledge. But in modernist country, it's only the double-blinded randomized controlled trial
Mm.
that establishes knowledge.
Mm.
And all else is suspect.
You can develop an internal argument as well. I don't know if that amounts to knowledge, like philosophy does. It's probably more speculation, yeah. But that's just as foreign as the empirical thing that you're talking about.
Right.
Is there a way in?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Oh, is it okay if I weigh in?
Yeah,
Oh,
sure.
of course, Bob. Yes, please do.
So I was really trying to follow along closely to what we're saying here about the nature of knowledge, and what I would argue is that it's the model here is perfect because interconnection comes out of experience, a type of experience where there is a relationship between the subject and the object. So I become immersed in the experience of an interconnection of all things. So in my experience of being healed, that's completely different than being cured in a Western sense, where everything is divided and everything is cut up into pieces that can be measured, that can be separated out from everything else. So a cure in that sense, or a substance that's used in the Western model of medicine is completely different than your healing necessitating the experience of interconnectedness. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me in the sense that, when we, in the indigenous paradigm that I understand, that it's about asking the invisibles for help. It's about working with the body. It's about working with the emotions. It's about working with the person's relationships in which they're embedded, and it's about mystery
That's
because
exactly what I was going to say. It's
Yeah, it is about mystery.
subjecting yourself to the will of the great mystery.
Mm. And even if you're not ill, there's a strong argument that you should do that.
indeed, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's what I think I'm trying to do with, well, that's what I advocate with writing now, if it can be done at all. Or to show the gaps. I think one of the ways to do that is to show the gaps in your self-will as a writer.
Mm. I love that paper you wrote about criticizing oneself, being one's own critic.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh, that's good.
and I thought of a term. You're welcome to run with it if you'd like. I thought of a term called radical uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what I saw you saying, is that we have to practice whatever we say, we have to practice radical uncertainty. Does that fit? Is that accurate?
Yeah, it does. And that kind of journey of uncertainty could show itself as a writer and not make much sense at all. But for an Indigenous writer, it could fill an entire thesis. And it doesn't have to be autoethnographic or anything like that. It's just a demonstration of how you start off with a kind of a proposition, and then you show the shortcomings of that. And within that particular sentence, you show another shortcoming. And so, I don't know, it's possibly something that could go on for quite some time. And it wouldn't make much sense to the Western tradition.
No.
No.
But if I read you correctly, it is everything is also its opposite.
Mm-hmm.
That in the sense of the wholeness of things, that there is no binary.
Yeah. Well, yeah. That's what I speculate about it. Yeah. We operate in a world of binaries at the moment. Yeah.
Intense binaries.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, that's the nature of modernism, I think, is to create others and attack them. I mean, that's certainly what we see in the United States right now, is this othering and attacking of the others,
Mm-hmm.
whatever they are. Um, and I is it what is do you have some thoughts about, so what is that gain for modernism? I mean, what is the value for modernism of fragmentation? Like, how is that good?
Well, it positions the human self as separate for a start, and then the human self can put themselves above the rest of the world. It has that potential. Descartes did that notably, and then I guess you can then assign everything their proper categories, and as that kind of supreme human self, you can then assign where everything else goes. You can't readily do that as an one of many interconnected entities.
No, you can't, because you can't necessarily correctly predict what will happen with any given action.
Mm.
I mean, I think you have to observe. I mean, we do something and then we observe its effect, and that gives us some clue about the nature of the spider web in which we find ourselves. But it doesn't necessarily give us the big picture.
No.
But if your model of the world is that it's basically like a machine, then you treat it, you're treating it kind of like a car engine that's broken. You isolate the problem in order to understand it, as opposed to a living entity that is interconnected in every way.
Right, right. But okay, so my question is, why do they want to do this? I mean, is it like it's is it control? Is it power? Is it dominance? What is it? I mean, I suppose something about that must be true because the colonizers, I mean, they consolidated power, control, and dominance.
Yeah. I think if you look back in history, if you look at the original, so Heraclitus was believed that the world was in a state of flux, and then Plato said, no, we have to kind of make the world static and introduce the notion of forms and ideas, and you disregard the world of appearances so that you can obtain certain knowledge. I think it started there. I think it's a means to obtain certainty about the world. I mean, as Indigenous peoples, we might say that to be uncertain is to be in a good state of being. And we might look at that model and think that's a model for ill health. You render things static in your mind, then you're doing something to the rest of the world, which is unhealthy, and also to yourself. But from what I can gather, people, Heidegger, for instance, placed the origin with Plato, and Plato's drive to make sure that that something was knowable, and to dispel certainty. So it's not only to make sure something's knowable, perhaps it's also a fear of the unknown. So by doing this, you get to drive away the fear of the unknown. And actually, if you look at a lot of post-colonial writing, you see reference to and critiques of the West having a fear of the untamed world that Indigenous people. It sort of relates to that, I think.
So it comes down to control and the sense of knowing. And I suppose if you know, you can predict. And if you can predict, well, then it's sort of tautological. If you can predict, you can control. But I mean, for me, what's interesting is, so I work in healthcare, and we try so hard to control people and fail so miserably because we focus only on the physical, and we have no sense of embeddedness in community and interconnectedness and even emotional and spiritual. And so we obsessively attempt to control the physical and fail miserably at improving health, and then blame the people that we're theoretically working on. They're not really people anymore. They're objects of production almost. They're widgets. Like, we don't see them as human. And and these electronic medical records that we have to use these days even emphasizes that, because in the old days I could write down stories about people's lives, and they would carry over into future notes. But that's not the case anymore. And so whatever I might say about a person's life, it will disappear. It won't carry over. Only the things that fit into check boxes carry over. And but the odd thing is that we don't notice that our project isn't working. We don't notice that our attempt at control and certainty isn't making people healthier. Like they're not any better. But also we don't seem to care. It's very strange. I suspect it's similar in New Zealand, though not quite as bad from my value judgment as in the United States because of our combining capitalism with healthcare.
Yeah, that probably gives a different flavor to it.
Yeah.
Somewhat.
Yeah. Well, because we get rewarded. The more things we do to you, the more reward we get, whether or not they help you. In fact, it's immaterial if they help you. The fact is, if we can justify doing something to you, then we get rewarded.
Yeah.
There's no sense of, so what is like this all about? What are we really trying to accomplish here? Or I suppose I'm saying that from an indigenous perspective because they would, I mean, in that other paradigm, they would say, well, we're improving the numbers.
Keeping the machine going.
Keeping the machine going. We're keeping the machine going. Yeah.
Yeah. I think education's become a bit like that as well in its own way.
Indeed. Yeah. Yeah. Well, here we fight, and you may too, with the bank account model of education, that you open your skull and we deposit information into it, and then you go away knowledgeable, as opposed to you have an experience. We provide an experience for you, and you learn something from that experience.
There's certainly a bit of that. And at postgraduate level, there seems to be a growing insistence on seeing an empirical method. You know, what is your method? Is the big question when you're doing a doctorate. Now, if you're doing something like what we're talking about as a PhD, you might not be able to readily identify a method. You might be able to in some ways, but you might decide to. But you're always questioned about, you know, what method are you using? And it, certainly for research funding, if you go for a research project, they like to see an empirical method.
Oh, they do.
Yeah.
They do. Yes, indeed. And I've been reading, and you may know, I'm blocking on her first name, but Tuwahi Smith.
Oh, Linda. Yeah, Linda.
Yes, Linda.
Yeah.
Yeah, decolonizing methodology. It's a beautiful book, but it probably wouldn't get me a research grant. You know that it's so interesting. I mean, one has to write the grant in the language of the colonizer in order to do work that's decolonizing. It's quite schizophrenic. to think
Yes,
of.
it is. Yeah, it is. It's quite weird, that sort of thing, isn't it? When you
Yeah,
sit back and think about it. Yeah. Because by method they mean an empirical way of ordering things in the world.
yeah.
Yeah.
They mean a sort of objectifying gaze.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's interesting, and maybe you have some thoughts on this. The I just recently proposed a study to the IRB, our IRB, Institutional Review Board Ethics Committee. And what I'm proposing to do is to gather stories of people's lives and to see if people who read those stories would come to the same conclusions about the elements of about those people's lives. I'm just wondering if three people would see a life in the same way.
Mm.
It seems like a relatively innocent study to me. And I have another goal, which is I'm working on a which is somewhat non-indigenous, but I'm working on a computer simulation model to predict dementia. And I need interconnected data in order to do that. And so I'm wondering if I can get sort of holistic data out of a life story interview that can be quantified. So you might say that I'm like doing two-eyed seeing work, or but at any rate, the 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 strange thing to me about all of this, I mean, whether or not my ideas are meaningful, was how worried the IRB was about the risks of people telling their life story. And I thought, everybody loves to tell their life story. I've done over 300 life story interviews, and no one suffered. Everyone enjoyed it and got something out of it, and um, felt better for telling their life story. And that didn't matter to the IRB. They said, well, what if one person suffers from telling their life story? And so I said, well, I'll sit with them. And they said, well, at the university, you're not qualified to sit with them. So you'll have to refer them, and on and on and on.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it just seems so odd to me that they would think that talking about yourself was dangerous. That telling your story was somehow risky. And
Mm.
I think I'm missing some modernist assumption here.
It's probably fear of emotion, is it?
It could be, yeah. I mean, because people do get emotional when talking about their life stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what makes it lovely. I mean, that's
Mm.
what makes it enjoyable.
Mm.
But maybe the modernist paradigm is, rationalism sort of says, suppress your emotions, perhaps.
I think so, yeah. Because it's not objective, and it's again that sort of thing that defies knowledge, isn't it?
Yeah,
Mm.
Yeah, it gets it. Those dirty emotions get in the way of our rational thinking.
Yeah.
indeed, indeed. Yeah, yeah. Huh. Well, it's um You know, I think thanks, I think we can make a difference within tribal communities. Within, I don't know that we can change the world much as I'd like to.
No, it's like the world has a particular trajectory to go on, and yeah.
Right. Right. Well, you know, this year at our Sundance, I was looking at the tree and I got this message. We don't think the humans are going to make it.
Mm.
That's okay. We'll come up with some new plan. Personally, I'll put my money on the raccoons. I know
On the
you
what?
don't have raccoons. They're sort of rodent-like mammals.
Yeah, they're
Yeah,
quite cute. Yeah,
they are quite cute, and they have opposable thumbs.
yeah.
I think
There's their
they'll be.
beauty.
Yeah, I'm betting on their taking over when we disappear.
That's fine. Yep, let them take over.
Yeah, I like
Absolutely.
raccoons. Maybe we'll all come back as raccoons
Yep, that's fine.
in the next iteration.
Just don't bring me back as a human being.
Right, right. Well, there won't be any more humans.
No,
We'll be extinct.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, I know you have a class to teach at noon, so
Yeah.
probably we should wrap this up. But it was
Oh,
really a pleasure to meet you and to
you too.
speak with you. Yeah.
Mm.
And someday when I get to come to Christchurch, I hope to meet you in person.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah,
You must let me know if you're coming. Yeah.
I will. And you know, because maybe we can do something together at the university. Some
Yeah.
dialogue would be
I'm
fun.
fully into that. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
that would be great.
Thanks for
All right.
inviting me.
Oh yeah, thanks for being a part of this. And it was a real pleasure. And I'll just turn off the recording. Okay.